6. U.S. Law and Policy Framework, Indian Territorial Dispossession and Indian Assimilation. Like the miner's canary, the Indian marks the shifts from fresh air to poison gas in our political atmosphere, and our treatment of Indians reflects the rise and fall in our democratic faith. Felix S. Cohen, 1953. To examine the federal Indian boarding school system, the department spotlights the following aspects of federal Indian law and policy. The Continental Congress, Congress of the Confederation, and the United States recognize Indian affairs as a main function of a national government. In engaging Indian tribes, separate sovereigns pre-existing the Constitution, and later, Alaska Native villages and the Kingdom of Hawaii, the United States pursued a twin policy: Indian territorial dispossession and Indian assimilation, including through education. The U.S. Senate later explained that twin policy as follows. Beginning with President Washington, the stated policy of the federal government was to replace the Indians' culture with our own. This was considered, quote, advisable, as the cheapest and safest way of subduing the Indians, of providing a safe habitat for the country's white inhabitants, of helping the whites acquire desirable land, and of changing the Indian's economy so that he would be content with less land. Education was a weapon by which these goals were to be accomplished. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson delivered a confidential message to Congress on Indian policy, explaining a strategy to dispossess Indian tribes of their territories, in part by assimilation. According to President Jefferson, a policy of assimilation would make it easier and less costly in lives and funding for the United States to separate Indian tribes from their territories. President Jefferson described two means: to provide an extension of territory which the rapid increase of our numbers will call for. The first was to advance an assimilation policy directed at Indian children to discourage nomadic practices and adopt sedentary practices dominated by Western agriculture development. To encourage them to abandon hunting, to apply to the raising stock, to agriculture and domestic manufacture, and thereby prove to themselves that less land and labor will maintain them in this better than in their former mode of living. The extensive forests necessary in the hunting life will then become useless, and they will see advantage in exchanging them for the means of improving their farms and of increasing their domestic comforts. The second, to be executed alongside the assimilation policy, was to encourage Indian tribes to purchase goods on credit so as to likely fall into debt, which would cause Indian tribes to cede their lands to the United States, with proceeds of such secessions, as described further below, predominantly funding the federal Indian boarding school system. As President Jefferson said in an unofficial and private capacity in order to, with safety, give a more extensive view of our policy respecting the Indians. We wish to draw them to agriculture, to spinning and weaving. When they withdraw themselves to the culture of a small piece of land, they will perceive how useless to them are their extensive forests, and will be willing to pare them off from time to time in exchange for necessaries for their farms and families. To promote this disposition to exchange lands which they have to spare and we want for necessaries which we have to spare and they want, we shall push our trading houses and be glad to see the good and influential individuals among them run in debt, because we observe that when these debts get beyond what the individuals can pay, they become willing to lop them off by a cession of lands. As the United States developed, this twofold approach informed federal Indian law and policy. The United States Constitution, ratified and adopted in 1788, expressly names Indian tribes and Indians. The United States has since recognized the sovereign political status of Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages, and the accompanying nation-to-nation relationship with them for centuries. It is well settled that the authority of the United States in regards to Indian affairs is grounded in the U.S. Constitution. Specifically, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2, reserving for the federal government the power to make war. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, reserving for the federal government the power to make treaties. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, reserving for the federal government the power to regulate commerce with the Indian tribes. The U.S. Supreme Court has recognized that because Indian affairs were also traditionally considered aspects of American military and foreign policy, Congress's legislative authority rests in part not only upon affirmative grants of the Constitution, but upon the Constitution's adoption of pre-constitutional powers necessarily inherent in any federal government, namely, powers that this court has described as necessary concomitants of nationality. As the court has said, these powers comprehend all that is required for the regulation of our intercourse with the Indians. The court has consistently described Congress's power to legislate in respect to Indian tribes as plenary and exclusive, while extending to all legislative measures relating to Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages. Such powers are not absolute. 2 centuries of Supreme Court case law establish there is an undisputed existence of a general trust relationship between the United States and the Indian people. The federal government, following a humane and self-imposed policy, has charged itself with moral obligations of the highest responsibility and trust, obligations to the fulfillment of which the national honor has been committed. The court has recognized that, throughout the history of the Indian trust relationship, the organization and management of the trust is a sovereign function subject to the plenary authority of Congress. Because the Indian trust relationship represents an exercise of that authority, the Supreme Court has explained that the government has a real and direct interest in the guardianship it exercises over the Indian tribes. The interest is one which is vested in it as a sovereign. On Indian reservations outside of Alaska, the government would provide only sufficient land for their actual occupancy, divided among them in severalty, and in lieu of money annuities. Stock animals, agricultural implements, mechanic shops, tools and materials, the manual labor schools for the industrial and mental education of their youth. The reservations were, in effect, envisioned as schools for civilization, in which Indians under the control of the agent would be groomed for assimilation. This report considers the intergenerational impact of the federal Indian boarding school system in light of the laws and policies that gave that system form, which derived from constitutional and pre-constitutional powers, establishing the United States' unique political relationship with Indian tribes, Alaska Native villages, and the Native Hawaiian community as distinct and sovereign political entities. 6.1. U.S. War-Making Power. The War Department's historical role in Indian affairs. And indeed, if it be the design of Providence to extirpate these savages, in order to make room for the cultivators of the earth, it seems not improbable that rum may be the appointed means. Benjamin Franklin. Congress acknowledged that from the beginning, federal policy toward the Indian was based on the desire to dispossess him of his land. Education policy was a function of our land policy. Although formal nation-to-nation relations between the United States and Indian tribes predate the Constitution, the provision of education to Indians by the federal government begins with the creation of the War Department. The first law of Congress relating to Indians was that of creating the War Department in 1789, which entrusted the Secretary of War with responsibility for such duties relative to Indian affairs as the President should entrust to him. Congress enacted the first explicit appropriation for Indian affairs in the Act of December 23, 1791, which appropriated funds for the Department of War, for defraying all expenses incident to the Indian Department and for defraying the expenses incurred in the defensive protection of the frontiers against the Indians. The policy of the federal government soon after expressed support for federal and non-federal education of Indians. In President Jefferson's first address to Congress in 1801, he described how Indian assimilation policy was central to federal policy. Among our Indian neighbors, also, a spirit of peace and friendship generally prevails, and I am happy to inform you that the continued efforts to introduce among them the implements and the practice of husbandry and of the household arts have not been without success, that they are becoming more and more sensible of the superiority of this dependence for clothing and subsistence over the precarious resources of hunting and fishing. Starting in 1802, Congress authorized appropriations of up to $15,000 annually to promote civilization among the friendly Indian tribes and to secure the continuance of their friendship by promising funding, goods, livestock and animals, and staffing resources, thus advancing the public responsibility to Indian education. In 1817, the United States began more clearly developing its policy of assimilation through education. President James Monroe advanced that, with the Indian tribes, it is our duty to cultivate friendly relations and to act with kindness and liberality in all our transactions. Equally proper is it to persevere in our efforts to extend them the advantages of civilization. Congress then laid the groundwork for a general system of Indian education by enacting the Civilization Fund Act in 1819. The purpose of the act was providing against the further decline and final extinction of the Indian tribes, adjoining the frontier settlements of the United States, and for introducing among them the habits and arts of civilization. To accomplish the act's mission, Congress authorized the President, in every case where he shall judge improvements in the habits and condition of such Indians practicable, and with that the means of instruction can be introduced with their own consent, to employ capable persons of good moral character, to instruct such Indians in the mode of agriculture suited to their situation, and for teaching their children in reading, writing, and arithmetic, and performing such other duties as may be enjoined according to such instructions and rules as the President may give and prescribe for the regulation of their conduct in the discharge of their duties. A report of the proceedings adopted in the execution of this provision shall be annually laid before Congress. To carry the Act's provisions into effect, Congress appropriated an annual sum of $10,000 and further required an annual report of the proceedings adopted to execute the Act. The funds annually appropriated under the Act were often apportioned to various religious instructions and organizations until Congress repealed the annual appropriation in 1873. In 1824, Secretary of War John C. Calhoun established the position of Superintendent of Indian Affairs within the War Department to formalize the administration of Indian Affairs, which had supervisory responsibilities for the federal Indian boarding school system. The duties of the superintendent included administering the Civilization Fund. The superintendent reported annually to the Secretary of War from 1825 to 1832. In 1832, Congress established the Office of Commissioner of Indian Affairs under the direction of the Secretary of War and subject to presidential regulation, with responsibility for the direction and management of all Indian affairs and all matters arising out of Indian relations. The Commissioner, a precursor role to the Assistant Secretary, Indian Affairs, was appointed by the President with the advice and consent of the Senate. From 1832 to 1894, the Commissioners of Indian Affairs provided annual reports to the Secretary of War. In 1849, Congress enacted legislation that established the department and transferred Indian Affairs from military to civil control. The act directed the Secretary of the Interior to exercise the supervisory and appellate powers now exercised by the Secretary of War Department in relation to all the acts of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Congress routinely debated about the practicality of transferring Indian Affairs back to the War Department. The question whether the Indian Bureau should be placed under the War Department or retained in the Department of the Interior is one of considerable importance, and both sides have very warm advocates. The heads of the Commissioners of Indian Affairs reported annually to the Secretary of the Interior from 1849 to 1932. After responsibility for the administration of Indian affairs was transferred to the department, Indian police supported the removal of Indian children and their placement in the federal Indian boarding school system. In 1886, for example, U.S. Indian agent Fletcher J. Cowart described the effort by Indian police to forcibly remove Mescalero and Icarea Apache children from their homes and furnish them to the federal Indian boarding school system. I found the attendance at the boarding school about half of what it should be, and at once set about increasing it to the full capacity of the accommodation. This I found extremely difficult. When called upon for children, the chiefs, almost without exception, declared there were none suitable for school in their camps. Everything in the way of persuasion and argument having failed, it became necessary to visit the camps unexpectedly with a detachment of Indian police, and seize such children as were proper and take them away to school, willing and unwilling. Some hurried their children off to the mountains or hid them away in camp, and the Indian police had to chase and capture them like so many wild rabbits. The hope for the effective work lies with the children. School facilities should be enlarged, the children divorced from nomadic camp life, and with a plain English education instructed well in farm or mechanical labor. Despite the official transfer from military to civil control, Congress continued to empower the President and War Department to continue support for the federal Indian boarding school system, with select jurisdiction, infrastructure, and personnel, including through statutory provisions such as the following. The President may detail officers of the United States Army to act as Indian agents at such agencies as, in the opinion of the President, may require the presence of any Army officer. And while acting as Indian agents, such officers shall be under the orders and direction of the Secretary of the Interior. The Secretary of War shall be authorized to detail an officer of the Army, not above the rank of captain, for special duty with reference to Indian education. The Secretary of War is authorized to set aside for use in the establishment of normal and industrial training schools for Indian youth from the nomadic tribes having educational treaty claims upon the United States, any vacant posts or barracks, so long as they may not be required for military occupation, and to detail one or more officers of the Army for duty in connection with Indian education, under the direction of the Secretary of the Interior at each such school so established, provided that monies appropriated or be appropriated for general purposes of education among the Indians may be expended under the direction of the Secretary of the Interior for the education of Indian youth at such posts, institutions, and schools, as he may consider advantageous or as Congress from time to time may authorize and provide. The Secretary of the Interior is authorized to establish and maintain the former Fort Apache military post as an Indian boarding school for the purpose of carrying out treaty obligations, to be known as the Theodore Roosevelt Indian School, provided that the Apache military post and the land appurtenant thereto shall remain in the possession and custody of the Secretary of the Interior so long as they shall be required for Indian school purposes. The War Department continued to provide support and personnel to further the objectives of the federal Indian boarding school system, even after Congress transferred responsibility for Indian affairs to the department. 6.2 U.S. Treaty-Making Power, Indian Territorial Dispossession, and Indian Assimilation. Through treaties and other agreements, Indian tribes ceded to the United States approximately 1 billion acres of land. Like Great Britain and the colonial governments before it, the United States negotiated and entered into formal treaties with the Indian tribes as separate and distinct sovereigns. From 1722 to 1869, The British Crown and the United States made at least 374 treaties with Indian tribes. As non-Indian settlement increased over time, the negotiation power of Indian tribes diminished. The U.S. Congress has emphasized that education policy took place in the context of wave after wave of invasion by white settlers, reinforced by military conquest. Treaties, although almost always signed under duress, were the window dressing whereby we expropriated the Indian's land and pushed him back across the continent. The treaty clause of the Constitution reads, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made, under the authority of the United States, shall be supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding." As a result, Indian treaties and successive statutes, including during the federal Indian boarding school era, originate with the Constitution and involve U.S.-Indian relations, U.S. Native Hawaiian relations, and political relationships unique to Indian tribes, Alaska Native villages, and the Native Hawaiian community. More than 150 Indian treaties between Indian tribes and the United States included education-related provisions, the terms of which often varied. For example, the 1794 treaty with the Oneida, Tuscarora, and Stockbridge Indians provided that the United States will provide during 3 years after the mills shall be completed for the expense of employing 1 or 2 suitable persons to manage the mills, to keep them in repair, to instruct some young men of 3 nations in the arts of the miller and sawer, and to provide teams and utensils for carrying on the work of the mills. In contrast, the 1864 Fort Laramie Treaty between the United States and the Great Sioux Nation mandated that, in order to ensure the civilization of the Indians entering into this treaty, the necessity of education is admitted, especially of such of them as are or may be settled on said agricultural reservations, and they therefore pledge themselves to compel their children, male and female, between the ages of 6 and 16 years, to attend school, and it is hereby made the duty of the agent for said Indians to see that this stipulation is strictly complied with. The text of many Indian treaties evinces that Indian education was a priority in U.S.-Indian relations. In 1871, Congress ended treaty making with Indian tribes, but existing treaty obligations were expressly validated and affirmed. Thereafter, the federal government used only statutes, executive orders, and agreements to regulate Indian affairs. 6.3. Indian Child Removal, a part of historical U.S. policy. Many Indian families resisted the assault of the federal government on their lives by refusing to send their children to school. Kennedy Report, U.S. Senate, 1969. After 1871, Congress enacted laws to compel Indian parents to send their children to school and to authorize the Secretary of the Interior to issue regulations to secure the enrollment and regular attendance of eligible Indian children who are wards of the government in schools maintained for their benefit by the United States or in public schools. For example, under the Act of March 3, 1893, Congress authorized the Secretary of the Interior to withhold rations, including those guaranteed by treaties, to Indian families whose children did not attend schools. The Secretary of the Interior may, in his discretion, establish such regulations as will prevent the issuing of rations or the furnishing of subsistence, either in money or in kind, to the head of any Indian family for or on account of any Indian child or children between the ages of 8 and 21 years old, who shall not have attended school during the preceding year in accordance with such regulations. And as the federal government has stated, the eventual abolition of the ration system, which in many instances has had the effect of forcing the children into school, has been made possible through the ameliorating influence of the government and church schools. The United States has applied such federal regulations, including removal of Indian children to off-reservation federal Indian boarding schools, without parental consent. For example, the department has recognized the federal effort to transport Indian children from the Navajo Nation to off-reservation federal Indian boarding schools without parental consent as follows. In 1919, it was discovered that only 2,089 of an estimated 9,613 Navajo children were attending school, and thus the government initiated a crash program of Navajo education. But because of the lack of schools on the reservation, many Navajo children were transported to boarding schools throughout the West and Southwest without their parents' consent. There is ample evidence in federal records demonstrating that the United States coerced, induced, or compelled Indian children to enter the federal Indian boarding school system.